Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to have Dr. Diane Negra join us as our distinguished guest on today's episode. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our guest for today's episode. Dr. Diane Negra is a professor of film studies and screen culture at University College Dublin and member of the Royal Irish Academy. The author, editor, or co-editor of 14 books, her scholarship spans media, gender, and cultural identity, from post-feminist selfhood and Irish cultural politics to economic austerity and the pathologies of American life. Her latest book, I'm Sorry You Feel That Way, The New Cultures of Customer Service, published by Stanford University Press in 2026, examines bureaucracy, civility, and rage in today's service economy. A guest professor at Brown University, the Free University of Berlin, the University of Reims, and Aristotle University in Thessaloniki. Professor Negra has received research awards and fellowships across multiple countries, including the Government of Japan Award that took her on a national lecture tour. She chairs the Royal Irish Academy's Working Group on Culture and Heritage, serves on the Inter-Academy Partnership Working Group on Predatory Journal, and was elected chair of the Irish Fulbright Commission in 2019. A dual citizen trained at the University of Texas at Austin, she has been based in UK and Ireland since 2002. Today, Dr. Diane Negra joins us to discuss her book, I'm Sorry You Feel That Way, The New Cultures of Customer Service. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diane Negra to the podcast. Professor Diane, we deeply appreciate your gracious acceptance of our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to host you today.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you.
Thank you. Professor, your book argues that 21st century capitalism has created an antagonistic interference between customers and service workers. When did you first realize that this antagonism wasn't just anecdotal irritation, but a structural feature of contemporary consumer life?
Well, I think that antagonistic interface started to show itself in more and more commercial settings. And your listeners may think right away about places like airports, which have become sort of premier scenes for customer frustration and anger. But I think that antagonistic interface that can play out between customers and frontline workers has expanded to a wide range of settings that includes hotels, banks, universities, lots of different places where we attempt to sort of, obtain goods and services in the marketplace. I think it's become much more pervasive than it used to be. I also think we have freed ourselves in some cases from earlier norms. So I do think that we feel in some cases more free to complain. But I also think that employees have freed themselves from earlier scripts of decorum about, some of these scripts were based on the idea that the customer is always right. And that idea certainly is no longer applicable in many cases. So I think that the antagonism that so often plays out between customers and those ostensibly there to serve them has become so broad, so widespread that we can see it in almost every industry these days.
Professor, you described today's poorly served customer as the defining figure of commercial relations under the digital capitalism. If we think of earlier eras, having figures like the organization man or the ideal housewife, what does this new figure reveal about who has power and who doesn't right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the idea that so many of us are frustrated in our attempts to move through commercial spaces of one kind or another, again, is applying to everyone except a very narrow and small elite who can afford to buy their way out of these kinds of dilemmas and problems. I was struck last week, for example, by a story that made the rounds in the news. It was reported in the New York Times, among other places, that the current Pope, Pope Leo, had attempted to change his address and his details with his bank back in Chicago and hadn't been able to do so and actually been hung up on someone by phone. They they insisted that he had to come into the bank in order to make that change. And he said, well, I've given you my security words and this kind of a thing. So, a situation that many of us either have experienced or could easily imagine experiencing. So I think that the idea that the frustrated and poorly served customer has moved to the fore of our cultural experience is very, very plausible. And I think it has displaced other archetypes. One of the other archetypes, is that this kind of, as you say, a man who is aspirational, who where we feel as if the rules of capitalism are sort of working for us. I think the fact that now the frustrated and angry customer has such a high profile suggests that we no longer have that confidence in a capitalism that works, but that something has changed and that we feel very disadvantaged by it.
Professor, one of the most striking claims you make is that corporations have effectively shifted large bundles of work onto customers, often under
Yes.
the guise of convenience or empowerment. Can you walk us through a concrete example where this so-called convenience is really just unpaid labor in disguise?
The phrase for your convenience, our radar should go on because that phrase is often an alibi. It's sort of the obvious indicator that something is actually not convenient. Things are inverted when we use that phrase. And the other thing I would say about convenience as a logic system in kind of realms of customer service is that when we are told that something is convenient, we haven't asked for it to be convenient. We are told that it is. It starts off as being optional, and then it very quickly becomes mandatory. So I think we want to have our kind of we want to really notice when we're told something is convenient. I think that that's something we should be aware of. But to answer your question more directly, I would think about, for instance, something that has become very common here in Ireland, also in the United States, which is the elimination of human beings in the grocery store who check out your purchases. And we are increasingly expected to do that ourselves using a self-serve kiosk. And they often work very poorly, so poorly, in fact, that experience of being a customer trying to ring up our groceries and running into problems has actually started to pop up in popular movies and things like this. I think that self-service checkout is a perfect example of shifting labor to the customer while telling us that it's sort of for our own good. There's something condescending and patronizing, I think, there. And I've certainly noticed in several different countries that it comes in as an option and it quickly becomes mandatory so that, there aren't any human staff left at all. I don't know anyone who, was calling to be able to do that work, who felt urgently that they wanted to do it, for example. You could also argue, and this is a speculative point, I haven't researched this, but I would also notice that in my own experience, the kinds of groceries that scan more easily are processed foods. It's very hard, for example, to scan a pineapple, right? Or things that are awkward or unwieldy, which tend to be fresher foods, fruits and vegetables and things like this. So one of the kind of oppositions or concerns that I would also have about self-service in grocery stores is that they are built for processed foods more than they are natural foods. And the last thing I would say on that subject of self-service in grocery stores is that so many people are frustrated and enraged by their attempts to ring up items in this way that it has given rise to a new phenomenon that I write about in the book and call middle-class shoplifting, that has also more recently been called micro-looting, in which affluent people or reasonably well-off people steal things partly because of the inconvenience of trying to figure out how to actually pay for them. And that to me is a very powerful signal that customers do not enjoy or wish for this kind of a technologized experience.
Professor, the book emphasizes how technological platforms with high failure rates and elaborate digital complaint systems actively produce frustration, impotence, and even fury in everyday service encounters. What do these emotions tell us about the hidden curriculum of consumer life today?
Yeah, I think hidden curriculum is a really good way of putting it. Um, Again, I think that recognizing that our consumer experience is increasingly tethered to a range of digital systems that are presented to us as if they are self-evident, as if they work well and never fail, is something that many people are grappling with. And when I talk about customers, I'm also seeing the role of the customer being brought into new spheres. So to a great extent, I work in a university, and I think oftentimes we now treat university students as customers. One of the things that we often require now is that students submit their work through digital systems, and one of the most prominent of these is called Canvas. I don't know if it's used in India, but it had a spectacular failure this week. Just in the exam season, it affected many universities in the United States, including Columbia in New York. So I do think that we have been placed in a situation over and over and over again where we're either directly purchasing something or perhaps indirectly purchasing it in the case of university tuition, and that we are expected to take up the learning process when it comes to these systems, however long it may take us, and often in the total absence of any form of customer support. And the time that that takes away from other activities in our lives, it's often is significant, first of all. And I think secondly, it often becomes a form of supplemental work that's done in the evening or early in the morning or as best we can fit it in because we aren't taking a lunch break. I think there is an enormous amount of kind of unmapped labor that customers are now doing through these kinds of digital systems and often finding the experience not only to be time consuming and time wasting, but deeply frustrating and aggravating because the systems don't work smoothly.
Professors write about a new corporate authoritarianism that enforces stripped down service protocols not just through rules, but through norms, customs, and affective culture. How do media representation of good customers and bad customers help police our behavior in these systems?
Yeah, I have one chapter in the book that explores how media representations in things like Hollywood films, television series, advertising, print culture, parody material, things like that, represent the customer experience. And I look at a wide range of time periods and media forms, as I say. But there are a couple of big points I can make on the basis of that. One is that while we occasionally get clownish representations of befuddled male customers who, let's say, can't master a technology or something like that, in comparison to digital natives who can, many times men's customer service problems are represented as more easily solvable, let's say. And men are often represented as more judicious about complaining and more justified when they do complain. One of the films that I discuss in the book is the famous romantic comedy, romantic drama, if you prefer, Pretty Woman. From the very late 80s, early 90s with Julia Roberts and Robert and Richard Gere. And of course, there's a famous sequence there when he has given her money, or he's given her a credit card, I suppose, to go out shopping in Beverly Hills. And because she reads as, she isn't dressed correctly and this kind of thing, she's rebuffed by the sales clerks. And she goes back with having not purchased anything. And he's annoyed by this. And he goes back with her and he just basically announces that they're going to be spending a lot of money and he expects good service and everybody falls into line. So one of the things we can take away from that sequence, I think it's well remembered by a lot of people, is that first of all, there will be different levels of service for the rich than for other people, and secondly, that a powerful man, has power in the marketplace sort of automatically, right? So a problem that this woman cannot solve is easily solved when a man kind of swoops in. The other thing I talk about in the book is, there are a variety of stigmas and prohibitions against complaint. I think people who complain are often caricatured and stereotyped, and they're often done so in ways that emphasize that they are female or feminized because they complain. And I think one premier figure that's been doing that in our recent popular culture as part of a folklore of entitled middle class kind of customer behavior is this figure of the Karen. And one of the things that the Karen does is she marks the place of a white woman who expects good service and who becomes ridiculous and overweening and obnoxious when she doesn't get the good service that she expects. And I think, that archetype, of the woman who is often middle-aged, who maybe remembers a time when service was better than it currently is, operates very powerfully to prohibit and shut down any behaviors that could be read as complaining without justification. So I think on the one hand, we've seen the removal of many forms of customer support and good service and knowledgeable and professional and courteous and competent service. But on the other hand, our popular culture has tended to operate in such a way as to stigmatize complaint and to suggest particularly that certain kinds of women, when they look for good service, are being arrogant and entitled. And I think that has had a very forceful effect.
Professor, in your analysis, high status and low status customers are treated very differently, with premium
Yes.
tires often marketed as a kind of salvation from everyday indignities. What does this hierarchy of service say about inequality under contemporary capitalism?
Well, I think that's true that we see tiered service provision everywhere now, and we've become quite habituated to it. As I was just really starting to write my book in earnest, I read a book that I think is very good and very useful called The Velvet Rope Economy. And the author of that book essentially argues that everything now operates the way that, a red carpet or any kind of status marker that says here's where the wealthy and entitled people go and here's where everybody else goes. That kind of model has become very normal, and I think we have to sort of increasingly try to resist this wherever we can, push back against it for sure. And I think that it's right to say that customer service is now suffused with class warfare. And the idea that there is a top tier or a segmented, kind of provision of service, or that you might only be entitled to good service if you are an elite member or a premier person or a member of a particular club, let's say. We've really seen this expand, certainly with airlines. That's been true for quite a while, but increasingly also with hotels that have separate VIP floors, separate VIP provisions. There was a lot of social media attention paid about a year ago to Las Vegas, which is a very important holiday destination in the United States, of course. And it showed enormous queues of people attempting to check into their hotel rooms. And meanwhile, just kind of in an adjacent area, there was a kind of a premier or a VIP check-in that was completely empty. And I think that's stark illustration of the experience of some, kind of preferred people as opposed to the general population is certainly a very sad commentary on the kind of the status of democratic provision in this relatively early stage of the century. And I think anytime we see that, we again just want to be able to sort of notice that as a deformation of what I would consider to be appropriate customer service, because the rejection of some customers as less worthy than others is, of course, the flip side of the designation of the VIP or the elite or the status customer. So I think the migration of certain kinds of ways of doing capitalism that have been rolled out by the airlines have started to migrate into other sectors now.
Professor suggests that shift to customer work has become totalized and naturalized. We barely notice we are doing it anymore. What kind of small act of refusal or awareness do you think are still possible within systems that seems designed to be inescapable?
Well, I think whenever we can, we should avoid the smartphone-shaped world. I think so many forms of customer work take place through a smartphone. That's the premier piece of technology through which we've taken up the burdens, through the QR code or whatever it may be. I would urge anyone, while recognizing the difficulty of this, I would urge anyone who can to detach from various forms of technology. You might be pleasantly surprised by how many times there is a workaround when you refuse to take out your smartphone and do customer work. I think in general, deplatforming ourselves is healthy and good. So I think all opportunities should be taken, to do that. I think we also have to be very conscious of any privatization of public services. One of the things that I'm tracking very closely at this point is the attacks on the U.S. Postal Service and other national post offices as well, but in the States it seems particularly egregious at the moment. So anytime that something that is a public necessity, healthcare, postal services, water provision, it's clear that individuals in various countries around the world are going to be increasingly competing with corporations for basic goods like water, for example, and energy. In fact, that's already starting to happen. I think we want to fortify government agencies that protect customers, right? This is the opposite of what is happening in the United States at the moment, in which the current political administration has really attacked the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It's one of the first things they did when they got into power. So I think it behooves us to make customer rights part of the political agenda, to talk more about it, to support and advocate for political candidates who recognize the need to help customers. And then I think in the small ways that you alluded to, I think anything we can do in our daily life can have a beneficial effect. Now, I don't want to be naive, and I don't think we can pretend that, I don't necessarily I live in a small country that has only a few banks, so I'm not really in a position to easily change banks or find a better level of service because it's an oligopoly, right? So there's not much that's going to change there. But I think you should still strongly express your concerns and your preferences when you can. And I think that we have to dislodge shareholder value as a prime imperative. We have to stop thinking, about it. We have to stop, among other things, looking at the stock market as some kind of measure of the health of our societies. It absolutely is not. So I think that, if we can do anything we can, small, medium, or large, to push back against the abandonment of anti-monopolistic norms and practices, that is a very good thing. And then I would encourage people, just in terms of their daily lives, when customer work is foisted upon them, if you can take your business elsewhere, you should, and you should explain why you're doing so. And I think I try. I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I do try in my individual interactions with customer service workers to call to their attention the absurdities of the system. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, I was in an airport lounge, and I was aware that the person I was interacting with had probably been trained, as a lot of customer service personnel are, to be relentlessly enthusiastic and quite deceptive. And so as I checked into the lounge, I said to this man, I said, "Is there a place where I can store my bag?" And he said, "Absolutely." And he smiled a really big smile as he said it. And okay. And, he didn't say anything further. So I said, "Okay, where can I store the bag?" And he said, "You can keep it with you." And I thought, well, that's extremely strange news, but he'd clearly, I think, been trained, because I think no human being would naturally be like this. He had been told you don't say no. So he couldn't say no. So he pretended that the absence of a service you would normally get in a lounge was in fact happening when it wasn't. He tried to sort of strangely gaslight me into thinking that my keeping my bag with me and looking after it was the same as putting it someplace safe. That was really strange. So I kind of looked at him and I sort of said, "That's a bit odd. Do you realize that the answer you've given is rather strange?" And he looked at me and I sort of, I'm not really sure what came of that encounter, but I do think we can just in small ways push back against those moments when we are dealing with people who've been trained to interact with us, and to pretend that things that have been taken away haven't been in that particular instance for just to give one particular experience that I had.
Professor, the book also maps how corporate discourse tries to preserve a fantasy of choice and agency. We are delighted you have chosen us, even as options narrow and hurdles multiply. How does this cheery language function ideologically? And what happens when consumers start to see through it?
Oh yeah, well, in a way, we were just talking about this, I think. But yeah, as we talked about a moment ago, I think certain phrases like "for your convenience" should definitely be read as red flags. And I talk a little bit in the book about how the term journey has become naturalized in corporate discourse. For example, when you engage with a bank to look into getting a mortgage related to a home purchase. So I think that when they start talking to you about going on a journey, you should be very worried because that suggests a lot of time and a lot of exertion is going to be necessary in order to get the service that you want or to buy the thing that you want. So I'm very mistrustful, as I've already suggested, about a kind of commercial climate that trains staff to never say no, to be evasive, to be disingenuous, and I really find that to be, quite worrisome. That this kind of dishonest, quite frankly, discourse that we often get in commercial settings now. I think the other thing to say on that subject, and I would really be borrowing from the work of great sociologists like Barbara Ehrenreich here, but so much of the feeling of contemporary capitalism is so committed to a kind of cheerfulness in all contexts, even when it is not warranted. So I think we have to do more to not play by this kind of cultural script that requires all of us, and perhaps especially and to be able to, for example, I mean, I talk in the book about this in American English and in European versions of English in the last, 5 to 10 years, the word problem has become a taboo. You're supposed to say issue, right? So, and we see this everywhere, even in journalism now. You don't say the word problem. It's like there's a strange idea that by saying the word problem, you have made a problem. So why do we do that? And why do we engage in all of this happy talk? I think we can afford, we're all adults, and I think, we can be able to call things what they are when the circumstances warrant. So I think this language of falsity, this language of upbeatness and cheeriness is often very deceptive, and it's often a kind of a layer over a kind of circumstances that are increasingly austere, increasingly customer unfriendly, also associated with a restriction of choice. I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is how we have become habituated to environments in which companies tell us how we will pay them, right? That we see definitely a big uptick in cash refusal in various businesses. There is a sense that we are dictated to when it comes to how, not only will we do the work of paying, but it will be the company's preference as to how we pay. So I think those kinds of things are very, very worrying, and we need to try to assert ourselves as customers to say, hang on a minute, we have rights here too, and we don't just fall into line with whatever is profitable and preferential to a large corporation. But I think this heavy, heavy emphasis on cheerful, upbeat language, the prohibitions on saying no can produce these contortions and distortions of language at times that are truly surreal. And the experience I was mentioning in the airport when I asked if I could stow a bag and I was told I could, but I really couldn't, is indicative of that kind of strangeness that we sometimes see now.
Professor describes these new service cultures as an assault on dignity that is
Yeah.
rarely named as such. How do you see this erosion of dignity connected to broader social and political frustrations, whether around work, democracy, or trust in institutions?
I think it's very closely connected. And I think that the loss of dignity that we routinely experience, being mistreated as customers, plays no small part in two big developments. One is ambient anger in public life, which in a country like the United States is also matched with high gun ownership. So we want to be mindful of this. And also a broader disaffiliation from the collective, a broader sense of what in Latin is called caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, that we see the world in a darker way. We see the world as out to trick us, out to get us, out to exploit us. So I think that the positioning of the customer as a mark, the positioning of the customer as having to be hyper aware at all times, reading the fine print, signing things electronically, all of this kind of stuff, not being entitled to clear explanations or good service, being put at the back of the queue if you don't have status. These kinds of things are all, I would regard as failures in our society, failures to value individuals and failures to accord the dignity that everyone deserves. You shouldn't have to have, you shouldn't have to be a platinum status executive, in order to be treated decently. So I would account for the very high prevalence of anger and loneliness, particularly in the West. I can't speak for other contexts, but as linked very much to the degradation of customer service and the feeling that so many of us have that as customers, we are constantly being played. I would account for, there's often a kind of rumination of, oh, why did people get so angry? Well, I think this is one of the ways.
Professor, I want to conclude this episode with one last question.
Mhm.
Finally, for listeners who recognize their own lives, all your over case studies, endless calls, broken chat box, futile complaint forms, what do you hope they take away from the book in terms of how to narrate, understand, or possibly contest these experiences?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that I guess we've touched on this already, and I would urge in both small ways and large ways that people feel that as customers they have the right to be treated well and to advocate for that as much as they possibly can. When I say that, I'm very aware that that's hard to do when there's no person present, right? Or when you're dealing with being on hold for an hour and a half or trying to somehow communicate with a chatbot or, something like that. But where you can, I think it's important to do that. And I think that, the micro politics of customer service are not trivial. And I would resist the tendency that I think we often have, which is to sort of say, "Oh, this isn't really a problem," or "Oh, I'm just complaining," or there's a phrase that's often used, "Oh, this is just a first world problem," right? So I think we have been schooled in a language that of almost deference to corporations, in which we are apologetic about the problems that they have inflicted upon us. Now, I'm not urging that we should all turn into, rampaging, expectant prima donnas. Far from it. But I do think we could go a lot further in suggesting that we oughtn't to be treated in the way that we often are. But in order to reach corporations who've specialized in making themselves inaccessible in recent years, we are going to have to look to government. We are going to have to, I think, increasingly make this part of our political agenda, as I was suggesting a moment ago. And again, to not buy into the dismissive kind of characterizations that somehow suggest that these problems are not insignificant. They are highly significant. They cost us time. They cost us money. They frustrate us. They lead to all kinds of poor health outcomes in terms of all of the ways in which when we are unhappy and frustrated and challenged and diminished, it tends to affect our bodies, right? So in all of these ways, I think we have to fight for a better customer service experience. We have to try whenever possible to avoid companies that treat us badly. We have to be conscious of the necessity to change our politics so that we have true competition in the marketplace. And I think that gives us a broader range of options so that if we feel we are getting poor service in one location, we can go to another. So those are the kinds of things I hope people might take away from the arguments I make in this book.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this conversation on I am sorry you feel that way and the new cultures of customer service. It's clear that what often feels like just everyday frustration is actually telling us something important about power, dignity, and life inside 21st century capitalism. I hope this discussion gives you new language and framework to make sense of your own encounters with call centers, platforms, and self-service systems, and maybe to recognize that the problem is not your patience, but the structures you are navigating. Thank you, Professor Diane, for sharing such rich insights. We appreciate you joining us today. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.